The new Global Financial Pact Summit has agreed to further discussions on reforming multilateral development banks. The two-day meeting in Paris also settled on a financial compact to assist the poor in coping with climate change. Further, there was an agreement that countries can fight poverty and confront climate change both at once. This was announced during a joint press conference on Friday at the conclusion of the summit attended by President William Ruto. Also present were President of France Emmanuel Macron, International Monetary Fund Managing (IMF) Director Kristalina Georgieva, President of the World Bank Group Ajay Banga, and the US Secretary of the Treasury Janet Yellen. President Ruto stated that the session had also reached an agreement on the provision of more resources to support vulnerable countries. He said a win-win approach had been crafted, noting that the summit had also made progress on new global sources of financing for climate action and the plans to insulate them from national interests.
President Macron has convened us for what has been dubbed as the How Dare You Summit. And for sure, I think we have confronted financial orthodoxy. We have confronted shareholder power, global capitalism, and corporate power. And we have also had a conversation about big oil. Madam Lawrence Tobiana spoke about breaking taboos. Prime Minister Mia Mottley reminded us that this is not a formal decision-making forum, but a pivotal moment to set aside our national interest and end the perpetual blame game. I want to repeat here again, as I did before, this is not about North versus South. It is not about emitters or non-emitters. It's not about the rich versus poor, climate guilty or innocent, and the powerful or the powerless. It's about all of us, big and small. It's about us in our diversity. And it's about crafting a win-win outcome. These are the benchmarks we have established for ourselves. They will serve us as a criteria against which we must assess our agreement. We have agreed that no country should be forced to choose between eradicating poverty and preserving the climate. We have agreed on some additional resources to support the vulnerable and the poorer countries. We have advanced discussion on reforming the governance of the multilateral development banks. We have progressed the conversation on a new global source for financing for climate and the mechanisms that can be put together to insulate us from national interest and global power structure whose decision-making processes include all of us and not just a few shareholders. We are agreeing that for the first time, as we leave Paris, President Macron, and you have been incredible. You have run this like Kenyans should do. You have run it like a marathon. And the ultimate judgment of our success does not rest in our hands. In the coming days, the world will pass the verdict on us. But I must say, been part of this conference, we have made tremendous progress. I would have preferred to see a firm commitment building on the G20 debt suspension initiative to deploy a portion of the new development finance sought to provide greater fiscal space for heavily indebted countries by refinancing their maturing debts on more favorable and extended terms. Many of our countries lack the necessary fiscal room to take on additional debt. And we are saying this as we discuss this new financing system. We value the incredible support by the multilateral development institutions, World Bank and IMF. We also have a wonderful relationship with China. They finance our infrastructure development. The tension between the West and China is unhelpful, is unnecessary, and is as useless as the tension between the North and South when we discuss climate change. That is not necessary. We must find the formula that will bring all our financing to respond to three issues: urgency, scale, and to make it much more affordable. That is the conversation that we want to have, and hopefully we have laid the seeds of that conversation to happen. Again, thank you, President Macron, for making it possible for China to sit here and for the West to sit here, and those of us from the African continent to be in the equation. We don't take it for granted. We have agreed that we have to rethink. We are in a new normal. The new normal that came through the pandemic, into the Ukraine-Russia war, into the vagaries and what climate change is doing to us. Floods, cyclones, droughts, and the threat to humanity that we see. This new normal requires a new approach. We're all clear that up to 52 countries are facing debt distress. I listened to my sister Kristalina, and you know, Kristalina, we have a wonderful relationship. You have been immensely supportive of Kenya. But looking at this context and listening to the discussion about the SDR, the allocation, the reallocation, the application, the verification, the assessment, the next, I get a headache. Honestly, I sincerely think that there is a much more creative way of dealing with this. The same way we did it during COVID. There is a way we can do this so that those in distress, the 52 countries to start with, how do we make it possible for them? Since they are already assessed for the debts they owe, how do we make them enjoy the benefit of a pause or reschedule or whatever you want to call it, so that they can have immediate liquidity and create space for themselves? That is a conversation that I think we should have. And let me say, this will move us closer to addressing the crisis that we have today on matters liquidity. We have also had a conversation and progressed one on a new global sources of financing for climate action and mechanisms that can be better insulated from national interest. This will move us close to addressing the climate crisis as a global common good, as opposed to something that we have to play a balancing act with the national interest on one end and do this at scale. So they can do this at scale, urgency, and which as if our existence depend on it. Let me clarify. Emmanuel, you've been immensely, speaking to you as a member of the G7, you have been immensely accommodative of all the divergent views that have come on the floor and in all the fora that we have enjoyed ourselves here. We are saying we want this time round a mechanism that involves everybody, where we are all paying, where we are all involved, and where we all decide. Because climate change is not about the North or the South, it's about all of us. And the discussion about carbon tax is a discussion that is a must-have. And on this one, we do not want the North to pay for the South. We want all of us to pay. Whether it is aviation tax, whether it is fuel tax, whether it is shipping tax, we want to pay because we want to be on the table. The conversation about who has not paid what is very energy sapping. It is very tiring. We want to have a different conversation. And I am very happy that that conversation has begun in Paris. And thank you, President Macron, for making it possible for this conversation to happen. We have some time between now and the Africa Climate Summit in Nairobi between the 4th and the 6th of September. That is co-hosted by the Africa Union, and I was told by the chairman of the Africa Union who was here with us, the Africa Union Commission, to invite none other than President Macron. You will be a keynote speaker. We want you to carry the gains we have made here to Nairobi, onward to UN General Assembly, and finally to COP28. The progress that has been made here is immense. Let me tell you, President Macron, I know you said yourself that there is some work to be done. Yes, there is some work to be done. But we have plenty of time between now and Nairobi. We have like 3 months. As I told you yesterday, the UN Charter was negotiated in 2 months. I also said that the Bretton Woods institution where Kristalina and Ajay are working, they were negotiated in a little village, a little town called Bretton Woods in 1945, in 3 weeks. We have a lot of time between here and Nairobi, and between Nairobi and COP28, we can fix this and it can happen for all of us. Thank you very much.
The summit is an important milestone in our effort to evolve the global financial architecture to be more responsive to the tremendous challenges and opportunities facing us. And the last 2 days have made me optimistic about the progress we've made so far and the momentum that I believe can carry us forward in the coming months. I'd like to touch on our progress in 3 areas that I focused on during my time here at the summit. First, our initiative to evolve the multilateral development banks, or MDBs. Global challenges like climate, pandemics, and fragility and conflict are putting development gains at risk. That's why I called for the evolution of the development banks last fall to tackle these global challenges with sufficient speed and scale. Our goal is to strengthen the MDB's work on eradicating poverty and supporting sustainable growth, their traditional goals, not distract from them. We've made significant progress on the MDB Evolution Initiative with a broad coalition of shareholders. And our coalition has made preliminary updates to the World Bank's mission and its operating model. We're unlocking as much as $50 billion in additional lending capacity over the next decade. And our estimate is that the MDBs as a whole system could unlock $200 billion in new lending capacity over the same time frame, and that's through balance sheet measures that are either already under implementation or being deliberated. Now, that by itself would be a very significant achievement. We could have $200 billion in lending capacity that we didn't have before to invest in some of the most pressing problems facing the world: combating climate change, lifting people out of poverty, preparing for future epidemics, and much more. But the evolution is not just about the balance sheet. It's about making sure we use these resources in a more impactful manner. So we're pushing for additional reforms on a rolling basis. And this includes work to optimize our climate finance architecture. The IMF plays an important role in providing policy advice and technical assistance along with critical financing. We've had constructive discussions about ensuring that the IMF can continue to provide concessional lending now and in the longer term. And we call on the IMF to present all available options to put its poverty reduction and growth facility on a sustainable footing in the near term by the annual meetings. And we also call for a broad range of donors to meet the IMF's financing targets for the trust. Now, we also need to complete outstanding debt cases. Debt is a global challenge, and it requires urgent cooperation from all creditors. To that end, I'm pleased that all official bilateral creditors have reached consensus to move forward with a debt treatment for Zambia under the leadership of the Chinese and French co-chairs. And I just saw Premier Li at the high-level panel, and I'm encouraged that China is moving to help address the debt challenges facing developing countries. Beyond resolving outstanding cases, a productive first step to provide greater certainty and timeliness to the debt process would be the publication of a guide to the common framework for borrowers. Third concerns private capital mobilization. As we announced earlier this morning, the Investor Leadership Network, which includes companies with a total of over $10 trillion in assets under management, has launched a new commitment to accelerate pension fund and institutional investments in emerging and developing economies over the next 3 years. And the United States will work closely with them to facilitate investments in the critical areas of energy transition and sustainable infrastructure. I also continue to believe that MDBs should launch a set of more innovative tools to boost private capital mobilization. And that is a priority shared by many leaders of these institutions, like President Bonga. We've already taken significant complementary action. Through the G7, we seek to mobilize $600 billion for high-quality infrastructure investment through the public and private funds over 5 years, and the United States has already achieved $30 billion of its $200 billion commitment. And through initiatives like the JETPs, or Just Energy Transition Partnerships, we're bringing public and private sources of funding together to provide tens of billions of dollars to fight climate change and spur economic development in emerging economies. Well, the challenge to the world that has brought us here to Paris is to make sure the global financial architecture can orient the necessary finance toward the essential tasks of eradicating poverty, combating climate change, and building a global economy that allows people and the planet to thrive. There's a great deal of work to do, and I look forward to working with the leaders on this stage and many more to advance our shared efforts. Thank you again, Mr. President, for your leadership.
You've understood. These aren't just words. These are concrete answers. This is a follow-up mechanism, and at the very latest, in 2 years, we'll meet again, but there will certainly be some intermediate meetings and some in-depth changes. This mechanism is meant here as well to include on a very broad base, as President Ruto reminded us, this is our goal, not just with our governments, but with our civil populations. 2 comments by way of conclusion and some thanks. One comment, I think the strength of this summit was to bring together here a bit more than 40 heads of state and government, G7 member countries, major emerging countries, poorest countries, countries recently impacted by climate change, and who have an experience of vulnerability coming from all parts of the world. Our discussion was very free in our plenary session today, at our dinner yesterday, where people were called on for certain things, were criticized, but I think that's a necessary precondition to build this clear, lucid, serious structure. I think its method means that our summit was called upon to bring about unity in the international community in terms of the answer we bring to our twin problems, the fight against inequality and the fight for the planet. If we fail, we will certainly head toward a fragmentation of our international institutions. Those that exist have been progressively made less legitimate by the poorest, and people have money and ideas need to be able to contribute to it in a very different way, and that will come. I think our responsibility is to uphold this unity in the service of the common good and of our principles, which we have redefined here. Finally, I would like to thank everyone who made the summit possible. Obviously, the heads of state and government, the Secretary General, my personal representative, their teams, the team from the Élysée, which were all on board, the ministers who have been here, their closest teams, their national administrations, whether we're talking about the Quai d'Orsay or Bercy in France, the Foreign Ministry and the Finance Ministry, which contributes to the discussion of all these texts, and then the French Development Agency and many other structures. I would also like to thank the Paris Peace Forum and its team, which also were of great assistance, and all the NGOs and representatives of civil society who were involved. We made a commitment, and it was held that 50% of the delegations and of the invited delegates coming from all continents, but would also come from civil society. And I want to thank all the NGOs who made that possible, who were mobilized, the representatives of civil society, and especially of youth. We heard from yesterday in the opening session particularly, and who had a lot of feedback into the platform of the summit, our site, and everything that was set up by our Secretary General. And they will go on working with us over time in the follow-up mechanisms. I won't go on at any greater length. I would simply like to answer the 3 questions which we will have. Thank you. On taxation, I am in favor of an international tax financing the efforts we will be called upon to make to fight against poverty and for the climate. I had reminded you that France has applied 2 taxes which were earlier proposed on airplane tickets on the one hand and financial transactions on the other. But you will agree that an international tax is an international tax when everyone has adopted it. And as we saw with socialism, international taxes do not work in one single country. And we are finding ourselves at a technological frontier. We cannot go on hurting ourselves all alone in our corner. We are going to have to try to oblige others to follow us and to be all mobilized. We are in favor of an international tax on maritime transport because it's a sector which hasn't been taxed, and there's no reason that it shouldn't be taxed. There's no reason it should not contribute to all the efforts that are being made all around the planet. I think that's an excellent cause. We need to go on mobilizing people. We have a club of people who are like-minded, and I think that it's not the only area in which we're going to have to negotiate, but we will negotiate there, and we will begin with probably a very modest contribution because it's a sector which is decarbonizing and we're supporting them to that end, but it's also entirely justified that the very high, sometimes income streams which are made there be taxed. But for that, in order to work, we have to do the same thing that we've done with international taxation, minimum international taxation, which is that we need to have a series of countries that are following the lead. And to be very clear, if China, the United States, and some key European countries that also have large firms involved don't follow, then you'll set up a tax, but nothing will happen because the people who you tax will go toward countries where you don't pay the tax. And so obviously key countries in this area have to be brought on board, and we're going to go on working along those lines. And our next meeting at the IMO in July will be of decisive importance.
We had very engaged and frank discussion, and it is so very important that we did. Our world is changing rapidly. It is affected by more frequent and severe shocks. And it is a world with more tensions than we need at this time. We need each other the most today. Our economy has proven resilient despite of the shocks we experienced, COVID, the war. But it hasn't been without a cost. Interest rates are up, debt burdens are rising, the cost of living is high, poverty and inequality are increasing, and the consequences of the climate crisis are upon us, and they hit the hardest poor people and poor vulnerable countries that have done the least to cause this problem. So it is time to step up. It is time for leadership, and President Macron President Ruto, Secretary Jelen, my dear brother Ajay, we have to live up to the expectations that are put on us. I want to talk about 3 topics that are directly relevant to our work in the IMF that have been high on the agenda in these 2 days. First, debt. I completely agree with President Ruto that it is a top priority to ease the debt burden on countries, especially those who have been hit by exogenous shocks, countries with good governance, but suffering from these shocks terribly. We have made progress. We do have now the common framework delivering for Chad, for Zambia, and also countries outside of the common framework, Sri Lanka, Suriname, benefiting from bringing creditors, public and private, together. We recognize we have to accelerate that restructuring, make it predictable, timely, and providing breathing space to debtor countries through debt suspension during negotiations. This is what we have been advocating for. We now have the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable that brings, for the first time in the last decades, traditional Paris Club creditors, non-Paris Club creditors, China, India, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, and the private sector, together with the debtor countries. And I heard this call yesterday, so President Ruto, you're here representing countries. I can turn to you and say, yes, sir, this is being done. We have to recognize debt and climate are correlated and will be even more so. And therefore, we need to work on debt for climate swaps. The World Bank takes leadership on debt suspension clauses in their programs. At the IMF, we have an instrument called Catastrophe Containment and Relief Trust that allows us to provide directly debt relief to poor countries when they're hit by shocks. We used it in the past. We used it mostly for COVID. We are determined to use it for climate shocks as well. And talking about climate, let me turn to the second area directly relevant for our work. The IMF has, over the last years, integrated climate considerations in everything we do, because climate is macro-critical. We integrate it in fiscal policy, in monetary policy, in data, and of course we also have a financial instrument. Let me stress one area where the IMF has been tirelessly promoting action, and it is on carbon price. Our analysis shows that without carbon price, there is no chance, no flying chance, that we will meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius target by 2030. We will miss it. So we need to have this incentive in place. We advocate for inclusive approach that is including tax, but also trade and also regulatory actions, as long as they deliver trajectory on in the right direction, up on carbon price. We propose a carbon price floor that is fair. Poor countries pay less, middle-income countries more, rich countries, of course, they have the highest price. And then I agree with you, there is space to think of international deployment of some of these resources. We are not there yet, but there is movement. We were, just 5 years ago, covering 17% of emissions. Now we cover 25%. There is only 75% more to go. But with will, when there is will, there is way. And talking about financing, this is the third area very relevant for the IMF. We have created a new instrument, the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, first time in the history of the IMF, we provide long-term, affordable financing, 20 years repayment, 10.5-year grace. How did we fund it? We funded it with the goodwill on countries like France, and we look forward to the US contributing, that have taken part of their new SDR allocations, and per the promise made, they have made this available to the IMF to provide us affordable lending. We have reached the commitment, the pledge made in 21, the pledge of 100 billion. 60 billion of this pledge is already working at the IMF in the Poverty Reduction and Trust Fund and in the Resilience and Sustainability Trust.